between two worlds that seemed like they would never meet, Mohamed Salah had learned to exist like a person stretched between two invisible forces. One side, the bright nights at Anfield, where he was hailed as a savior, and the other side his homeland, Egypt, where every run he made carried the hope of millions of people he had never met. And in the space between those two places, he did not truly belong anywhere. Not completely a Western star, nor still the ordinary boy from Nagrig he once was, but a person who had to live two parallel lives. One life in front of the public, always strong, always smiling, always ready to carry the burden, and one life behind the lights where fatigue accumulated through every match, every flight, every expectation that never ended, where he could not allow himself to be weak, could not fail without paying the price of disappointing an entire nation, and that very tug of war had become a dull pain, not loud, but prolonged, forcing him to build an almost unbreakable will, a will formed not from glory but from moments no one saw, when he continued to move forward even when exhausted, continued to fight even when there was nowhere left to hide, because if he stopped, not only would his own dream end, but the faith of millions of people would collapse with it. But it was precisely in that inescapable pressure that he rose to become one of the greatest symbols of modern soccer. A player who, together with Liverpool FC, conquered the UEFA Champions League 2019 and ended the decades-long Premier League drought in 2020, winning many titles such as the FA Cup, League Cup, FIFA Club World Cup, and continuously breaking club scoring records, winning the Premier League Golden Boot multiple times, being honored as PFA and FWA Player of the Year, appearing in the FIFA Pro World event, and twice receiving the African Player of the Year award, becoming a source of pride for the Egypt national football team when he brought the team back to the World Cup and advanced deep in the AFCN many times. And beyond the pitch, he was also recognized for his enormous humanitarian contributions, building schools and hospitals in his homeland, becoming one of the athletes with the most positive influence in the world, proof that from the heaviest pressures a person can still create light bright enough to illuminate an entire generation. Before stepping further into the journey behind the spotlight of Mohamed Salah, please hit like and leave a heart as a quiet way to acknowledge what he has had to endure in silence. And if you want to understand what created the will of a person living between two worlds with nowhere to stop, please subscribe to the channel to follow the next journey together. No one saw where everything truly began. Not the bright stadiums or the passionate European nights, but a small village named Nagrig, where Mohamed Salah grew up among dusty roads and simple houses, where life did not have many choices and dreams were often a luxury for children born there, because from the beginning everything was shaped by circumstances, not by desire, and his childhood did not pass with carefree games or afternoons wandering with friends, but with early mornings waking up, long journeys of many hours on crowded buses where he had to squeeze among strangers, carrying a ball, and a hope that even he himself did not fully understand. Those trips were not journeys of joy, but journeys of endurance, repeated every day until they became part of his body, part of his life rhythm, and while other children grew up slowly, with time to make mistakes, to learn, to change, he did not have that privilege, because every passing day carried a sense of urgency, as if he stopped even for one step, everything would disappear, and no one said that to him. But he felt it in the eyes of his family, in the silence of his parents, in the way they looked at him like a rare opportunity to step out of a life they had endured for too long. They did not have much money, did not have connections, did not have open doors ready, but they had faith, and sometimes that faith was heavier than any burden a child could carry, because it did not allow him to fail, did not allow him to return as before. And therefore every run on the training field was no longer just the effort of a young player, but a response to all the silent sacrifices behind. The simple meals, the long working days, the times they stayed silent instead of voicing their worries, And he understood, even though no one said it out loud, that he was not allowed to give up, even when his body was tired, even when his mind wanted to stop. Because behind him was not just a personal dream, but an entire family betting on something they could not control. And it was in those long trips, in the moments no one noticed, that something changed. Not technique, not physical strength, but the way he saw the world. The way he accepted that this life would not be easy, and if he wanted to step out of it, he would have to sacrifice more than what others had to sacrifice, had to give up things he should have had to learn to be alone, learn not to need anyone to understand, and learn to continue even when there was no guarantee ahead. And that was when the will began to form, not from words of encouragement or moments of glory, but from deprivation, from having no other choice, from understanding that if he did not keep going, no one could go in his place. And while the world later only saw the goals, the titles, the brilliant moments, few knew that it all began with a boy who had to grow up too fast, not because he wanted to be the best, but because there was no other path to survive, and in the very loss of a normal childhood, a person was formed, not loud, not perfect, but strong enough to step into a world that later would demand more from him than anyone could imagine. There are fatigues that leave no trace on the body. No one sees them. No one asks about them, and there is also no way to explain them, only quietly accumulating over time until they become part of the person. And for Mohamed Salah, those days had begun very early, in the long bus rides, in the training sessions that ended when the sky was already dark, when the body of a child that should have been resting was pushed further, and no one stood beside him to say that it was too much, because in the world where he grew up enduring was not a choice but a necessity, and therefore he learned to stay silent before his own fatigue, learned to keep going without needing anyone to understand. Because sometimes stopping to explain made everything even heavier, and it was in that silence that a void began to form, a void with no friends to fill it, no carefree conversations, no afternoons of play like other children, only one path repeating every day, and the longer he walked that path, the more he realized he was drifting away from the world he should have belonged to, not because he wanted to be different, but because circumstances had pushed him out of the most normal things, and in that loneliness, the soccer dream was no longer something that made him happy, but became the only thing that allowed him to continue, a fragile thread keeping him tied to a goal that sometimes even he was not sure he could achieve. And that was when the questions began to appear, not loud, not clear, but enough to make a child pause in thought, whether all of this had any meaning, whether these sacrifices would lead somewhere or were just another endless loop of effort. And there was no one there to answer. No one said that doubt was normal. No one helped him understand that feeling not good enough was not a sign of failure, but only part of the journey. And therefore he kept all those questions inside, did not speak them, did not share them, letting them settle in the way time always does. But what time did not take away was the habit of silence, the habit of not showing emotions, the habit of enduring everything alone. And gradually that was no longer a reaction to circumstances but became nature, became the way he existed in his world, a world where everything was kept hidden, where emotions did not need to be spoken to exist. And when he stepped into larger environments, when challenges became more complex, that very silence followed him like an inseparable part, helping him stand firm against pressure, but at the same time making him distant, hard to reach, as if there was always an invisible gap between him and the rest of the world. And perhaps what few realized was that before he learned to face millions of eyes on the stadium pitch, he had already had to learn to face himself in moments no one saw. Moments with no cheers, no encouragement, only fatigue, doubt, and a decision repeated every day that he would continue even when he was not sure what was waiting ahead. And it was in that quiet repetition that a person was formed, not by victories, but by the ability to keep going when there was nothing left to hold on to except his own will. Then one day, the familiar road leading out of the small village no longer brought him back, but opened a completely different direction. When Mohamed Salah left Egypt to join FC Basel, a step many called an opportunity, but for him it was also a separation, as if a part of himself was left behind, where there were no longer dusty roads, no longer familiar voices, no longer eyes that understood him without words. Only a new world that was colder, more unfamiliar, and did not wait for him to adapt. There everything operated at a different pace, a different language, a different way of living, where he not only had to prove he was a good enough player, but also had to learn to exist as a person who did not belong there. Each training session was no longer simply practice, but a silent struggle to keep up with what was around him, to understand instructions that were not always clear, to blend into a collective where everyone had a more solid foundation. And in those moments he realized that talent alone was not enough, because there were gaps that could not be shortened by technique, but by time, by patience, and by the ability to endure the feeling of being on the outside. The cultural difference was not only in communication, but also in the smallest things, from the way of eating, the way of living, to habits tied to religion. Things that had once been natural in his life now made him stand out in a way he did not want. Not standing out because he was good, but because he was different. And in an environment where everything was fast and efficient, that difference sometimes made him feel slowed down, out of rhythm, as if there was always an invisible gap between him and the rest. No one said it, but he felt it in the way others looked, in the way they communicated, in the moments he stood alone after training, not knowing how to start a conversation and not sure if anyone really wanted to listen. The feeling of being separated from his roots did not come from a specific event, but from the accumulation of small moments when he realized that the things that had made him who he was could no longer easily exist here. And even though he tried to adapt, tried to change, there was still a part inside that could not blend in, could not disappear, and that very part kept reminding him of the place he had left, not with regret, but with a hard-to-name emptiness, because he understood that he could not go back as before, but also had not completely stepped into where he was heading. And between those two states he continued to move forward, continued to train, continued to play, and gradually the efforts began to bring results. He got more playing time, was recognized, was mentioned as a player with potential. The first goals came, the plays that caught the audience's attention, and for many people that was a sign of success, proof that he had chosen the right path. But for him that feeling was not complete, because every step forward came with a larger gap between him and where he once belonged. And even though he was getting closer to the dream, he was also moving away from a part of himself, a part that could not be replaced, could not be recreated. And in the quiet nights when there was no longer the noise of the pitch, no longer the rushed pace of the new life, he faced a feeling that no title could erase, that to achieve something bigger he had had to accept, losing things no one could see. And that was not a one-time sacrifice, but a prolonged process where every passing day demanded he let go a little more to exchange for a step forward that did not always bring peace. The runs on the Swiss pitch gradually became more confident. The accelerations began to make spectators stand up, and Mohamed Salah was no longer an unfamiliar name in the FC Basel lineup. He scored, assisted, created moments that made people mention him not only as a young player full of effort, but as a talent growing day by day. And for the first time since leaving his homeland, everything seemed to be heading in the right direction, as if the years of silence, the long trips, the unseen sacrifices finally began to have meaning. But it was precisely at that moment, when the dream seemed to be taking clearer shape than ever, that a new pressure began to creep in. Not loud, but persistent. Because when you start to be noticed, you are no longer allowed to just be yourself. You have to become what others expect, And each match is no longer an opportunity, but a test where every mistake is magnified, every slowed moment is remembered, and eyes from afar, from other stands, from bigger clubs begin to follow, not with patience, but with evaluation, as if they were waiting for an answer to the question whether he was good enough to step into an even harsher world. And in that context, confidence no longer came naturally, it had to be maintained, protected against growing doubts, because he knew that just one wrong step, one bad run of matches, everything he had just built could disappear as quickly as it had appeared, and that fear was not something he could share, not something he could say to teammates or coaches. It existed in private moments when he looked back at what he had achieved and wondered if it was solid enough to last, or just a short phase before everything returned to how it was, because the memory of the days when no one knew him was still there, still clear enough to remind him that everything could change at any time, and therefore, instead of enjoying success, he began to live in a state of alertness, always trying harder, always running faster, always doing one more thing to make sure he was not left behind. And that made the dream, instead of bringing relief, become a heavy responsibility, something that needed to be protected continuously, with no stopping point, no break. And the closer he got to the big doors, the clearer he felt the cracks forming, not in his career, but in his own emotions, when joy began to be replaced by anxiety, when each success was no longer enough to reassure him, but only made him think about having to keep it longer, having to prove it more, and in that process something began to change, not on the outside, but inside. Where the dream had once been a source of motivation, now it carried a silent fear that if he did not keep moving forward, if he did not meet what was expected, everything would collapse, and he would have to start over from the beginning, not just with empty hands, but with the memory of what he had once had, but could not keep. And that very feeling, even though no one said it, had made the days at Basel no longer simply the beginning of a journey, but the place where he learned a much harder lesson, that in this world achieving something is only the first step. Keeping it is what truly tests you. And sometimes the closer you get to the dream is when you feel it is most fragile. And then, when the door seemed to have opened wider, he stepped into an even harsher world, when he signed with Chelsea FC, where the name Mohamed Salah first truly touched the light of top-level soccer, where everything happened faster, stronger, and more ruthless than anything he had ever experienced. Expectations appeared from the moment he set foot there, not only from the media, from the fans, but from himself, as if all the years before had led him here and now was the time to prove he was worthy. But soccer does not always operate according to the logic of effort, and in a collective where every position had big names, where mistakes were not accepted and opportunities were not given many times, he quickly realized that being there did not mean being trusted. Playing minutes became rare. Substitute appearances were not long enough to make a difference, and each day passing on the bench began to stretch into weeks, months. Every training session still happened with the same intensity, the same desire. But when match day came, he became the observer again, watching teammates step onto the field while he could only wait, and that waiting brought no answers. No one explained clearly. No one said what he needed to do to change his position. Only silence from the coaching staff. A silence that made everything more vague, harder to grasp, and gradually he began to feel something he had never faced at this level, the feeling of being forgotten, not because he did not exist, but because his presence was no longer important in a group that was too big, where everyone was competing, where attention always turned to names that had already been established, and in that context, not being mentioned became a form of disappearing, a disappearance no one named, but enough to make a player wonder if he really belonged there or not. And it was in those moments, sitting outside the pitch, watching the match pass without his participation, that the doubt that had appeared before began to return. This time clearer, heavier, when he wondered whether what he had achieved before really reflected his ability, or was just a phase where he had exceeded his own limits in a less harsh environment, and when opportunities did not come. When time passed without change, the feeling of not being good enough no longer came from outside but began to form from inside, like a repeating voice saying, maybe he was not ready, maybe he did not fit. And what made it more painful was that he had no way to prove the opposite, because there was no opportunity to do so. And therefore he continued to train, continued to wait, continued to hold on to a fragile belief that everything could change, but at the same time also had to face the reality that sometimes in this world, effort is not always enough to create opportunity, and there are places where you can be left behind, not because you did not try, but because you did not fit what they needed. And that was a hard lesson to accept, especially for a person who had come this far by his own will, because for the first time, he was not only facing a challenge, but facing doubt about his own value in an environment where everything was decided quickly, and there was no room for patience. Then came a time when waiting no longer brought hope, when the days on the bench began to blur the once clear faith. Mohamed Salah understood that if he continued to stay, everything might end in the quietest way, not with a big failure, but by gradually disappearing from what he had once pursued. And therefore the decision to leave Chelsea FC did not come from confidence that he would succeed elsewhere, but from the fear that if he did not leave, he would no longer have the chance to prove anything. It was not a step forward, but a way to hold on to what remained of the dream before it completely vanished. And when he moved to AS Roma, everything did not immediately become easier, because what he carried was not only experience, but also doubt, memories of months without trust, the feeling that he had once not been good enough, and those things did not disappear just because the environment changed. They stayed, quietly affecting every run, every decision on the pitch, making him play not only to win, but also to prove he was not the person the past had made him believe he was. The training sessions at Roma became the place where he started again, not from zero, but from a position where he had to rebuild faith in himself. Every ball, every touch carried a greater effort than normal, not because he lacked skill, but because he needed to feel he deserved the opportunity he had, and gradually those things began to change. He got more playing time, participated in the team's play, goals appeared, bursts of speed that made the audience remember him, no longer as the forgotten name, but as a player who could make a difference. And with each such moment, the confidence that had been worn down began to return, not quickly, not completely, but enough for him to continue, enough for him to feel that what had happened before was not the end, but only part of the journey. And even though success gradually returned, even though he began to be mentioned as one of the dangerous attacking players, there was still one thing that did not change: the feeling that he was running, not toward a clear destination, but running away from what he had experienced, away from the image of himself when he was not chosen, when he was doubted, when he could not show his value. And that made every step forward carry a different pressure. Not pressure from outside, but from inside, where he always wondered whether what was happening was sustainable or not, whether he had really overcome the past or was only temporarily moving away from it. And in the quiet moments when there were no cheers, no pace of the match, those questions remained, reminding him that this journey was not only about soccer, but about finding back a part of himself that he had lost. And even though he was moving forward, even though everything was gradually getting better, there was still a gap between him and peace, as if he had never really stopped, never really felt he had arrived. Because for him, every step forward was not a confirmation, but another opportunity not to return to where he had once left. And then, when the next door opened, it not only brought Mohamed Salah to a new team, but brought him to a different version of himself. When he joined Liverpool FC, where everything finally seemed to fit together, where his speed, his instinct, and everything he had accumulated from the quiet years before suddenly exploded in a way that even he could not predict. Goals came continuously, movements became a nightmare for opposing defenses, And for the first time, the world no longer looked at him as a player with potential, but as one of the best, a name appearing in every headline, every ranking, every discussion about top-level soccer, and in that moment, the dream seemed complete. No longer something to chase, but something he was living in. But precisely when everything reached its peak, something else began to change. Not on the pitch, but outside it, when fame spread far beyond what he had known. From the stands in England to the streets in Cairo, from television screens to small phones in the hands of millions of people, he was no longer just a player for a club, but became an image representing many bigger things. And with that privacy began to disappear in a slow but irreversible way. Moments that had once been very ordinary now became rare. Steps outside the pitch were no longer anonymous. Eyes always followed. Conversations always existed. And personal life gradually shrank, not because he wanted to separate himself, but because there was no longer space to exist normally. And while people saw success, saw the titles, the records, the celebration moments, few realized that each step forward carried a greater responsibility, not only to the team, but to the people who had placed their faith in him, people who saw him as a symbol of hope, of rising above, of a story they wanted to believe was true. And therefore he no longer played only to win, but also not to disappoint them, to maintain the image they had built around him. And that made every match heavier, every mistake harder to accept, because it not only affected the result, but the way he was perceived, the faith others placed in him. And in that context, success was no longer a destination, but a state that had to be maintained, a standard that had to be met continuously, with no break, no forgiveness. And when he stood at the peak, he also stood in a narrower space where everything was observed, evaluated, and compared. And even though he had achieved what many only dared to dream of, there was still a part inside that was not completely at peace, because he knew that to keep this position, he would have to continue paying the price, not only with effort on the pitch, but with what he had to give up outside it. And it was in the fragile balance between glory and sacrifice that he realized success, no matter how brilliant, always came with a price. And sometimes that price was not something others could see, but the quiet voids in life that he no longer had the chance to fill. But when everything seemed to have reached its peak, when the name Mohamed Salah no longer needed to be introduced, but had become a standard, an obvious thing in the world of football, that was also the moment the world began to demand more from him than what an ordinary person could maintain. Because once you have proven that you can do something extraordinary, people no longer see you as a human being, but as a machine that must repeat it over and over again, without error, without deviation, without days when you are not at your best. And with each passing season, the pressure to maintain performance is no longer a personal goal, but becomes an obligation, something tied to his name, as if everything he did in the past had set a standard that he himself must continue to live up to, even if his body is tired, even if his mind needs rest, even if inside there are moments when he no longer feels as strong as before. But on the outside, no one sees that. They only look at the goal numbers, at the decisive plays, at whether he can still bring victory or not. And when things do not go perfectly, when there are matches where he does not score, when there are moments when he slows down just one beat, the criticisms begin to appear, not as individual opinions, but like a wave, spreading quickly and strongly, coming from the media, from social networks, from the very people who once chanted his name, as if they were demanding back what they believed he owed them. And in those moments, past success is no longer a support, but becomes a shadow that makes every mistake bigger, every shortcoming clearer, because people do not compare him with others, but with his own best version. And that is a comparison that no one can win forever. And as that cycle continues, when each match becomes a test, each season becomes a measure, the feeling of exhaustion begins to creep in, not suddenly, but slowly. accumulating through each day, each flight, each training session, each moment when he has to remind himself to continue, even if his body no longer responds as before, even if his mind is no longer as light as in the early days. But stopping is not an option, because behind him is not only a career, but an image, a belief, everything he has built. And therefore he continues, not always because of passion, but because of responsibility, and right in that continuation, a gap begins to form, not between him and others, but between him and himself, when he realizes that the person the world sees and the person he feels are not always the same. One side is the perfect, strong, unshakable image, while the other is a human being trying to keep balance between pressure and fatigue, between expectations and limits. And in that gap, loneliness appears, not because there is no one around, but because no one is really in the same state. No one feels exactly what he is carrying. And that makes success, even though it still exists, become quieter, less emotional, as if it has lost part of its original meaning, no longer something to celebrate, but something that must be maintained. And in that world, where everything is directed forward, where there is no room for stopping, he continues to walk, not because he is not tired, but because he cannot stop, and that, more than any title, has shaped the person he is at this moment, a person standing at the peak, but paying the price with a loneliness that no one can see. But if at the club level the pressure is still limited, then when he returns to wear the shirt of the Egypt national football team, everything changes completely. Because there, Mohamed Salah is no longer one of many stars, but the center of everything. The name that all eyes turn to, the person that millions of people believe can change the fate of an entire team, even bring pride to an entire nation that has waited too long. And in that world, each time he touches the ball is not simply a move, but a moment containing hope. Each goal is not just a number on the scoreboard, but joy spreading through every street, every family, every ordinary story of people who have never met him, but place in him an almost absolute trust. And that very trust, though beautiful, carries a weight that not everyone can understand, because it does not allow him to become ordinary, does not allow him to have days of underperforming, does not allow him to make mistakes without being seen as a failure bigger than reality. And when he steps onto the field in the national team shirt, he does not only represent himself, but also the unfulfilled dreams of a country, the people who believe that if he succeeds, they can also believe in something better. And therefore, each match becomes a test without a stopping point, where victory is seen as obvious, while failure is exaggerated in a way that it no longer belongs to the realm of sports, but becomes a common disappointment, spreading wide and deep. And in those moments, the boundary between love and criticism becomes thin, because the people who love him the most are also the ones who can turn their backs the fastest when he does not meet expectations, not because they want to hurt him, but because they have placed so much in him, to the point that when things do not go as expected, they do not know what to do except look for a reason, a person to blame. And that name is often him. And what makes it all more difficult is that he understands that the love they give him is real, that the trust is not fake, but at the same time, he also has to accept that that love always comes with conditions, always depends on what he can bring on the field. And that makes each time he plays no longer just part of his career, but a response, a way to keep the trust placed in him, and in that process, the fatigue does not only come from the physical, but from always having to carry a role bigger than himself, always having to maintain an image that he cannot leave behind, even when he is not playing, even when he returns home, because somewhere there are always eyes watching, expectations not yet relieved, and questions without answers. And that makes him never really get to rest, not because he does not have time, but because he does not have the space to return to being an ordinary person, A person who can make mistakes, can be tired, can stop without fear that it will collapse the trust of millions of people. And in that world, where love and pressure always exist in parallel, he continues to walk, not because he does not feel the burden, but because he knows that if he stops, it will not be just one person disappointed, but an entire country, and that is something he has never allowed himself to face. And then there was a night when everything seemed to converge. A night when all that Mohamed Salah had been through, from the dusty roads in Nagrig to the bright stadiums in Europe, all led him there. The 2018 UEFA Champions League final, where the biggest dream at club level stood right in front of his eyes, no longer distant, no longer vague, but clearly present in every run, every breath, and when he stepped onto the field in the Liverpool FC shirt, everything seemed ready, not only for a victory, but for a moment that would define his career, where all the efforts could finally be rewarded in the most complete way. And in the first minutes, he played like the person the world was familiar with, fast, sharp, full of confidence, as if everything was going in the right direction, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for all his life. But football, like life, does not always go the way people want. And in just a short moment, a collision with Sergio Ramos changed everything, not by a clear situation, but by a sharp pain spreading throughout his body, a pain that did not stop at the physical, but brought with it a premonition that something serious had just happened. And when he tried to continue, when he told himself that he could endure more, could overcome it, his body did not respond the way he wanted. And in that moment, between a match he could not leave, between a dream he could not give up, he realized that he no longer had a choice. And when he sat down on the field, when the doctors came, when his eyes began to change from determination to helplessness, the whole world seemed to slow down, not because the match stopped, but because a bigger story had just been interrupted. And when he left the field in tears, not the tears of a player who had just been injured, but of a person who had just seen his dream shatter right before his eyes, in a moment he could not control, could not change, could not go back. And that image, a hero leaving the field in silence, said more than any words, because it was not only about a match, but about everything that had led to it. All the sacrifices, all the efforts, all the pressures, and in that moment, everything seemed meaningless, not because he had failed, but because he did not have the chance to continue. And that left a void that no victory could fill. But that night did not end at the stadium. It continued in a way that few people saw, because the serious shoulder injury not only made him leave the match, but also cast a shadow over something even bigger, the 2018 World Cup, where he was expected to lead the Egypt national football team, where an entire nation was waiting for him as a symbol of hope. And now, when his physical condition was no longer guaranteed, when his spirit had just been broken, he entered that tournament not with full confidence, but with a silent worry that he was no longer himself, that what had happened was still there, affecting every run, every decision, and while everyone still expected, still trusted, he had to face a difficult reality to accept, that there are moments in life when no matter how long you have prepared, no matter how far you have gone, everything can still collapse in just 1 second. And the only thing you can do after that is to continue, not because you are ready, but because you have no other choice. And that night, more than any match, left a deep mark in him, not the physical pain that would gradually recover, but the memory of a moment when everything seemed within reach, then slipped away in a way he could never forget. What happened after that no longer belonged to a match or an injury, but spread like an emotional wave that Mohamed Salah could not control, because when he returned in the Egypt national football team shirt, all eyes still turned to him with the same trust, the same expectation that he would make a difference, that he would bring what they had waited for too long. But reality did not happen that way. His body had not fully recovered. The feeling of pain was still there, not always clear, but enough to affect every run, every move. And in a tournament where everything happened quickly, with no time to adapt, no space to regain the best feeling, those limitations began to show, not because he lacked effort, but because there are limits that willpower cannot overcome immediately. And when the results were not as expected, when the team did not go far, when the collective dreams were once again interrupted, the change began to appear, not suddenly, but gradually, in the way people talked about him, in the way the media asked questions, in the way fans shifted from hope to disappointment. And what made it more painful was that he understood they were not completely wrong, because they had trusted, they had placed in him more than what a player could bring, and when that did not become reality, they needed an explanation, needed a cause, and his name, although not the only cause, became the center of every discussion. Criticisms began to appear, no longer gentle, no longer patient, but direct, straightforward, sometimes cruel, not only about performance, but about his role, about his ability, about whether he really deserved the position he held or not. And in those moments, the affection he once felt began to change. Not disappearing, but becoming more complicated, as if it always came with a condition that he had to meet. And when he could not do that, that affection turned into pressure, into doubt, and that created a feeling that was very hard to name. When you are still loved, still mentioned, but at the same time feel isolated, because no one really stands in your position to understand what you are going through. No one feels the pain that has not completely disappeared. No one sees the silent efforts to come back. They only see the results. And those results are not enough. And when that repeats, when each match becomes an opportunity to be judged, each mistake becomes a reason to be criticized, the psychological pressure begins to accumulate in a way that has no break, no stopping point. Because even when he leaves the field, even when he returns to his personal life, those voices are still there on the screen, in the comment lines, in the questions he cannot avoid. And that makes recovery not only about the physical, but about the mental, about finding balance again in a world where everything is exaggerated. And in that process, another pain appears, not from the injury, but from the feeling of not being able to meet expectations. Not because he does not try, but because there are times when no matter what you do, it is still not enough. And for a person who is used to overcoming all limits, facing that is not easy, because it forces him to accept that there are things beyond his control, that not every effort leads to the desired result, and that very awareness, though necessary, carries a heaviness when he has to continue walking while knowing that everything is no longer as simple as before, no longer just about trying harder, but about accepting the limits he never wanted to face. And in that world where love and criticism always exist in parallel, he continues to exist, not as an untouchable symbol, but as a human being trying to hold himself steady amid the changes he cannot stop, and amid all that noise that never stops, amid the praises and then the criticisms, amid the expectations with no ending point. Mohamed Salah has only one place left where he can find true peace. Not the stadium, not the locker room, but the very small moments in family life, where he does not need to be a symbol, does not need to prove anything, just simply a husband, a father. And in those spaces, when he returns to his wife and children, when the eyes do not look at him as a hero but as a loved one, he can breathe at a different rhythm, a rhythm not controlled by the whistle, by the scoreboard, or by what the world expects. Those moments are not many, not long, but enough to remind him that there is still a part of life not caught in the vortex of achievements and pressure, where simple things like a meal, a small story, a quiet evening can bring a feeling that no title can replace. And precisely because of its rarity, those ordinary moments become more precious than anything he has achieved on the field, because that is the only place where he can be himself without being observed, without being judged, without being compared. But even that refuge is not completely perfect, because the dense match schedule, the continuous flights, the seasons that last almost all year make the time he is really with his family become scarce, divided into short intervals between two matches, two trips, two different pressures, and that creates a gap that he cannot completely fill. Not because he does not want to, but because he does not have enough time, and in the moments of leaving, when he has to return to the familiar cycle, a silent regret appears, not loud, but clear, when he realizes that he is missing things that many people consider normal, the moments of his children growing up, the times when his presence could mean more than any goal, and that is not easy to accept, because he understands the value of family, understands the meaning of being by the side of the people he loves. But at the same time, he also understands that the path he has chosen does not allow him to have it all, that every success comes with a trade-off, and in his case, that trade-off is not only about strength or time, but about the moments that cannot be recovered, the memories where he could not be present. And that very thing makes family not only the place he returns to, but also the place where he always feels he has never been there long enough. A place that brings peace, but also evokes a regret, because he knows that no matter how hard he tries, there will still be gaps that he cannot fill, and in the struggle between responsibility to his career and responsibility to his family, he continues to walk, not because he does not realize what he is losing, but because he has no other choice but to continue the path that has brought him here. A path where each step forward takes him further from what he wants to keep, but also closer to what the world expects of him. And in that very contradiction, family becomes the only place that helps him not completely lose himself, even though he knows he can only touch it in short periods of time, before having to return to the world he has never really left. And the further he goes on his path, Mohamed Salah increasingly realizes that what he is living is not a unified life, but two lives existing in parallel, but never really merging into one. One side is Europe with its fast pace, with modern stadiums, with widespread fame and the standards of top football, where he is seen as one of the best players, where everything revolves around performance, achievements, and competition. And the other side is his homeland, Egypt, where he is not only a player, but a cultural symbol, a spiritual pride, where every action of his is observed not only through the sports lens, but also through traditional values, religion, and identity. And between those two worlds, he has to learn to exist without losing any part of himself. But that is not simple at all, because what is accepted here sometimes becomes strange there. Ways of living, habits, values do not always match, and he always has to maintain a fragile balance, not letting himself be completely drawn into any side, because if he changes too much, he will lose his roots. But if he keeps everything the same, he may not fit the environment he lives and works in. And that very balance makes his life more complicated than what outsiders see, when he not only has to maintain performance on the field, but also has to maintain a clear identity between two different worlds, where he is both a sought-after superstar and an ordinary person with his own values, personal beliefs that cannot be changed according to circumstances, and that makes him never really free in the way many people think, because every choice must be carefully considered, not only for himself, but for what he represents, and in that process, a feeling gradually forms, not clear from the beginning, but becoming deeper, that he does not completely belong to anywhere. In Europe, he is always the person from a different culture, carrying indelible marks, while in Egypt, he is the person who has left, the person who has changed, the person living in a world that many can only imagine. And that very difference makes him stand between two sides, not eliminated, but also not fully integrated, like a boundary existing between two spaces that never have an intersection point. And that does not always cause clear pain, but it is always there. in the way he thinks, in the way he acts, in the way he chooses to keep what is most important to him, and when looking back, he realizes that his life is not a journey from one place to another, but a journey of learning to live between two places without losing himself, a journey with no clear ending point, no moment when everything becomes completely balanced, but only continuation, adjustment, and acceptance that there are things that will never be perfect, and in that very imperfection, he continues to exist, continues to walk, carrying both worlds within him, even knowing that there will be no day when they truly become one. And when looking back at the entire journey, Mohamed Salah is no longer the boy who left Nagrig with a fragile dream, nor the name that had to prove himself good enough amid doubts, but a person who has gone through all states of success and injury, a career that has been affirmed by titles, records, moments that millions of people will still mention for many years to come. But what is special is that, when everything seems to be enough, when no one can deny his position in modern football, his life does not become lighter as many people think, because there are things that do not disappear with time, pressures that do not fade when you reach the peak, but only change shape, become more subtle, harder to recognize, but still present in every step, when he no longer needs to prove who he is, but still has to maintain it every day, not for himself, but for everything he has built, for the people who still look at him as a symbol that is not allowed to weaken. And that very thing makes his journey have no clear stopping point, no moment when he can completely let go of everything and say that he is done. Because in the world he exists in, there is always a next match, a next season, a next expectation. And even though his body is no longer in the state of the early years, even though the fatigue has accumulated through each season, each injury, each time he has to stand up after falls, he still continues, not because he does not feel his limits, but because he has gotten used to overcoming them, has gotten used to moving forward even when there is not much energy left to do so. And in that continuation, there is something very quiet but persistent, a perseverance that does not need to be proven, does not need to be shown, just simply exists as part of who he is, like a reflex that has been formed from the early days when he had no other choice but to keep going. And even though the circumstances have changed, even though his position is different, that reflex remains, still leads him through each new challenge, each new difficult period. And perhaps what makes his story special is not how much he has achieved, but the way he continues after having achieved all of that, not stopping, not being satisfied, not giving up, but still walking with the same focus, the same will that brought him here from the very first days. And in that world, where everything is always moving, where there is no room for stopping, he still stands firm, not because he is not tired, but because he does not allow himself to stop. And right in that contradiction, between having enough and still having to continue, between having reached the peak and still having to hold it steady, an image is formed, not of a person who cannot be broken, but of a human being who still continues to walk, even though he has carried too much, a person who no longer looks for an ending point, but accepts that this journey will continue, not because he has not arrived, but because for him, there is never really a place to stop. The story of Mohamed Salah is not simply a journey of victory, but a recording full of heartache about the price of greatness, where each achievement is built on parts of life that have been traded away, that few people see. When looking back at the image of the boy in Nagrig who had to travel for hours every day to pursue football, we do not only see diligence, but also a childhood that was shortened to the point of almost not existing. When he stands between two worlds, one side is the bright European football field, the other is his homeland, Egypt, full of expectations. We realize he has never really had a place that fully belongs to him, especially the moment he left the field in tears in the 2018 Champions League final after the collision with Sergio Ramos is not only a physical injury, but a symbol of the fragility of dreams. where everything can collapse in just a few seconds. And even more painful is when he returns in the shirt of the Egypt national team. Not everything is love, but also criticisms, pressures from the very people who once honored him, forcing him to continue walking in a state of exhaustion, but unable to stop. What makes people heartbroken is not because he failed, but because he has never had the chance to be weak like an ordinary person. For American society, where success is often praised but rarely looks at the price behind it, this story is a profound reminder that behind every symbol is always a human being, and placing too many expectations without understanding can turn into invisible pressure. It teaches that success should not only be measured by results, but also by the way we keep ourselves and balance in that journey. Because sometimes the most valuable thing is not reaching the peak, but still being strong enough to continue when there is nowhere to stop. If the story of Mohamed Salah makes you think differently about the price of success, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a sign of respect for the journey he has silently endured. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone sees.